A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I never thought it would come to this, but when I realized that my boyfriend, Tom, was drifting away, I panicked. It felt like the perfect storm of insecurity and desperation swirled around me until one night I snapped. My mind conjured up the most outrageous idea to win him back. I would fake a pregnancy. At first, I told myself it would be harmless, a temporary ruse, but the moment the lie slipped from my lips during an innocent dinner date filled with awkward silences, it became a wild, spiraling adventure that went far beyond my control. I texted my best friend, Sarah, who was supportive in a way only true friends could be, and she helped me come up with excuses, starting with late-night cravings and nausea that came out of nowhere, fleeting symptoms I'd finally decided were real. We crafted photo evidence of my baby bump and even shamelessly spoofed a sonogram image found online, texting it to Tom with a trembling heart. He was overjoyed, eyes gleaming in that way I hadn't seen in ages, excitedly planning out names and so immersed in his role as an expectant father that he never questioned my sudden loss of sanity, not even for a heartbeat. The deception spiraled out of control, leaving me entrapped in an elaborate web of lies. I had to maintain this pretense while juggling a job I loved, and in moments of solitude, I'd catch glimpses of my reflection in the mirror, judging myself for becoming a monster, but the love I felt for Tom pushed my moral compass to the corner of my mind where shadows thrived. When the day came for my first ultrasound, panic settled in as I could neither continue the charade nor reveal that I duped him. I crafted a story about how I was experiencing complications and had to reschedule the appointment, which only deepened his devotion and excited fantasies. But then I began to feel the anxiety clawing at the edges of my consciousness. What if he found out? What if this lie unraveled? The paranoia turned my life into a waking nightmare. Constantly touched with guilt, I developed a meticulous routine to avoid our mutual friends, lest they notice I was never really carrying a child. It was like being trapped in a real-life game of charades, but slowly, my fake pregnancy morphed from something I'd control into something that controlled me, as Tom began making preparations for a nursery, which sent me spiraling into crushing waves of guilt. I remember the moment he pulled out that sun yellow paint swatch, his excitement bubbling over as he planned to transform the spare room, the mortification washing over me like ice water. I was ruining everything I once cherished, yet I couldn't stop. The more I faked, the more I couldn't escape the truth of my deception, until, one dark evening, I finally broke. The immense weight of my lies bore down fiercely, and I fell to the floor trembling in a mess of tears, clutching my phone tightly, ready at this moment to confess everything. However, my shame was compromised when Tom came in, laughing, a pack of baby clothes from his sister nestled under his arm. As he caught me off guard, and I fumbled, whispering something about feeling ill. It hadn't been that long of a deception, I thought, even as I recalled the months I'd already played this abominable game. And then it happened. Tom brushed my hair away from my forehead, eyes flickering with something that felt like pure love before he whispered those dreadful words. "Did you know pregnancy can bring on such weird symptoms, like pregnancy paranoia?" My breath caught. I couldn't form the words to respond, still lost in the web of deceit as my heart pounded dangerously in my chest. He waved a piece of paper in front of my face, and my stomach lurched. He had scheduled a baby shower with our friends, a baby shower, a festival of lies with laughter and kitchen tables lined with gifts meant to celebrate something that didn't exist. My entire world sparked in flames as that bloated idea danced back into my mind, setting off an even darker path. I thought I was pushed to my limits, but desperation has a way of breeding new lows, and the following day, instead of confessing, I concocted elaborate stories of testing that allowed me a temporary refuge to hide in the facade. That night my thoughts turned to terrible ideas about making my ruse more convincing. This could keep Tom. This could recapture his heart. I don't even know why, but I overdramatically collapsed while we drove to dinner, grabbing my stomach, claiming pain. The clenching of my gut was more real and visceral than any film's fake birthing scene, even as I gripped the seat with white knuckles. Panicked, we rushed to the emergency room, where the doctor's eyes narrowed as I muddled through my anguished screams and cries while a part of me recognized that I was crossing a line I would never recover from. Lying in that cold hospital bed under fluorescent lights, I could see how all this care for me would soon turn into rage if the truth were ever unveiled. And yet, in the midst of this hideous chaos, a strange thing happened. He held my hand throughout the worst of it, and a flicker of something like happiness ignited, one of those rare moments free from my profound guilt when I thought maybe being a mother was possible. But then came the nurse to check on me, and as she asked about previous pregnancies, I felt the ground beneath me shatter. I had never before felt so trapped, and I realized no lie is ever truly harmless, especially not this one, so deep it would drown us both. When the doctor returned with a surprised smile and ripped my sides with contradictions, "How do you feel about becoming a parent? And what did you think the baby's sex might be, sweetheart?" The crushing weight of the situation was upon me like never before. All of this had been orchestrated for a chance to dance on the edge of affection, but the darkness I'd conjured hung over my head like a guillotine. I wish I could relate a tale of redemption, where I escaped unscathed, but the truth can be sharper than any lie, and the only thing I remember was that moment when I held his hand, and it felt like reality. Then, when the truth broke free like a raven with a broken wing, the shadow of judgment was my only witness, because he was preparing to walk away forever, convinced I had manipulated him like marionette strings, and the room was falling apart, my shattered lies clattering in deafening silence. By the end of that night, I was left with more than just heartbreak. I was simply alone, grasping remnants of what felt like a fantasy spun into madness, the lie that had begun as a thread of hope unraveling to nothing, a terrible truth spiraling away only to find that deception can bind as tight as love ever could, but it feels heavier, much darker and ultimately fatal. It was an ordinary afternoon at the airport, busy with the usual buzz of travelers rushing to catch flights, the echo of rolling suitcases, and the bickering of families navigating the endless lines, but all that changed the moment my foot collided with the large glass door at Gate 7. I had been so distracted by my own racing mind, caught up in anxieties that twisted in my stomach like an uncoiling snake, that I barely registered the people around me until I heard the sickening sound of shattering glass, my heart plummeting as shards sprayed like broken stars across the polished floor. Yet when I instinctively turned to apologize, a strange calm flooded over me because nobody seemed to pause, no one flinched or turned to gawk like you would expect in such an embarrassing moment. Instead, everyone continued on with their lives, as if the shattering glass had been nothing but an echo of the mundane announcements buzzing overhead, and with each loud, reassuring declaration of boarding flights and safety regulations, I felt an overwhelming sense of being in a dream, a surreal world where I was completely invisible, and all I could hear was the frantic thumping of my heart echoing in my ears. As I stood there, feet glued to the tile as shards glittered dangerously at my feet, a creeping dread began to wrap around my throat. I took a deep breath and stepped back, the door now gaping like an empty mouth, and still, no one noticed, not even the security personnel lounging near their posts, seemingly absorbed in their phones, and I scuttled away from the wreckage, my pulse racing while I navigated the labyrinth of concession stands and weary travelers, the absurdity of it all gnawing at me like a missed flight. But in those moments beneath the buzzing neon signs and vast departure boards, I began to feel something dark and eerie creeping in. What would happen if I were to do something else, something no one would see? I wandered through the glossy hallways, captivated by the oscillating stream of faces that seemed more like a surreal tapestry than living beings, and my mind began to widen, envisaging myself pulling open emergency exits, sending alarms into frenzy, only to be ignored as travelers shrugged and walked by. The thought was intoxicating, thrilling. I imagined more glass, more chaos. What if I could throw a chair in the air and it would crack like thunder? Yet I knew it would never happen. The fear of being noticed, of being judged, sat heavily on my shoulders until something inside snapped. Wasn't I already invisible? I could feel the weight of premonition digging into my chest, that palpable darkness whispering to me, winding through my thoughts like smoke until I found myself rummaging through the airport's quiet corners, lost in this strange trance-like state I couldn't shake, the temptation growing as I submerged deeper into the rippling sea of oblivion. And it wasn't long before I stumbled upon another glass door, one that was locked. A creamy frame that gleamed under the flickering fluorescent lights, and I couldn't resist. My hand, trembling with a mix of anxiety and exhilaration, reached for my jacket but stopped short, a warning ricocheting in my mind. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay beyond that door had called to me, and I knew I had to know. I took a breath and threw my shoulder against the door. You might expect it to give with gusto, but instead, it crunched as if it were made of tissue, the sound reverberating oddly through the air as it shattered in a slow-motion cascade, a curtain of glass drifting slowly to the floor, and still, nobody turned. I stood, adrenaline coursing through me as I stared blankly into the employees' lounge I'd just exposed, people lounging in worn leather chairs, lying on tables, a few desolate souls staring blankly at their phones, and I felt an inexplicable chill creep down my spine. My own reflection dancing among the chaos as I realized I didn't belong to this world any longer. In a quickened breath, I stepped over the glass and into the vacant room, my mind spiraling with the possibilities of this secret passageway. Yet when I glanced back at the door I had just destroyed, it was gone. Only bare wall remained, as smooth as a canvas, with no remnants of my actions, and my heart thundered in my chest. Panic gripped me as I ran my fingers over the features of the building, emptiness swallowing me whole. I yelled, tried to scream, send warnings through the air, but the silence was absolute, as if I had submerged into a deep, dark abyss, and every shred of consciousness began to slip away until I became just another lost soul in this wild dream. Hours might have passed, or maybe only minutes, before a sing-song voice sliced through the silence, a lilting melody that filled the empty room, and as I turned to face the source, I saw a little girl with pale skin and glimmering eyes standing against the wall where the glass door used to be, her expression eerily calm like her features had been sculpted from candle wax, and she looked at me with unblinking curiosity, asking, "Are you going to come play with us?" Her voice echoed, sending chills racing across my skin, and behind her, shadows flickered, hints of figures in the gloom, all watching in hushed stillness as they melted into view, their faces twisted into mocking smiles that seemed too wide, crossing the line between happiness and something far darker. One, a man with ragged clothes and hollow eyes, started to hum an unsettling tune, and my instincts screamed for me to flee, but together, they captured me in their web, and I stood frozen at their periphery, something deep inside whispering that as long as I had shattered that glass, I would never leave this place. Yet the girl stepped closer, her laugh chiming like broken bells that rang in my ears, and then I felt it, the stinging realization that this terror was now my prison. And as the world beyond the walls continued to spin in indifference to my shattered reality, I knew my actions had unveiled something far beyond my understanding. This was no longer an airport, and I was no longer just some invisible traveler. I had unlocked a door that was never meant to open, and soon I would have to decide whether to play along or become another whisper among the echoes. I tipped the massage therapist $10 because I am cheap, but as I lay there in the dimly lit room, something sinister began to unravel around me, an experience I never anticipated when I walked into that unassuming spa. It began like any other day, tired from too many hours hunched over a computer. I sought solace in the promise of a deep tissue massage. The air inside was thick with the fragrance of eucalyptus, and soft music played lullabies of relaxation, luring me into a false sense of security as I was greeted by a woman named Elena, whose hands were said to work magic yet appeared to carry the weight of something more malevolent. As she began kneading my knots, I leisurely drifted into a blissful state, every ounce of tension uncoiling under her deft touch. But that bliss was short-lived. A strange heaviness replaced it, a sensation of being watched that prickled on the back of my neck, and when I glanced up, I saw a shadow shifting just outside the frosted glass door. But Elena didn't seem to notice, her eyes fixated with unnerving intensity on the structure of my back. I forced myself to look away, but a suppressed feeling churned in my stomach. Something was off, something beyond the mystique of relaxation that this spa promised. Then came the whispers, soft and indistinct, echoing against the calm. "You shouldn't have tipped her," they seemed to say, emanating from nowhere and everywhere all at once, worming their way into my consciousness. I gasped silently, my heart signing a frantic rhythm against my ribcage as the pressure increased with every stroke of her hands. "What a pity, you didn't learn," the voice continued, each word like ice water splashed against my skin. I could feel Ella pressing down harder, the massage turning into something more like a treatment of punishment, an overwhelming force that threatened to crush the very bones in my body. Suddenly, the lights flickered ominously, and in that moment of disorientation, I could have sworn I saw a figure flitting past the opaque glass, a gaunt face with hollow eyes staring in through the door. Panic surged through me. I needed to leave, to bolt from that table and never look back, but the weight of her hands felt like iron shackles holding me down. "Relax," Elena commanded gently, and despite myself, I felt a compulsion to obey. With every passing minute, the intensity of the whispers elevated, the voices pleading with me to heed the warning they presented, but who was I to question the depths of something I could not fully grasp? I tried to speak, to tell her to stop, to call for help, but my voice escaped into the ether, reduced to mere silence amid the cacophony of those ominous murmurs around me. Then, out of nowhere, a sliver of sunlight breached the cracks of the room, illuminating something dreadful. A collection of framed photos hung on the wall, each depicting a former client, the faces twisted in agonized rapture, frozen in those moments as if trapped in time. My blood ran cold as I recognized them, friends who had told me how rejuvenating their experience had been, how they felt lighter, happier, transformed. Each joyful smile now showcased the horror of what they had become. One face stood out, that of my friend Claire, her expression caught in a mask of ecstasy that bled into despair. The spark in her eyes dimmed to an empty void. Desperation clawed at my insides as a cold realization sank in like poison. Those voices, those muffled warnings were cries of the damned, victims of the secrecy between the spa therapist and the darkness behind the wall. I wanted to escape, yet my limbs felt impossibly heavy, as if every stroke from her hand siphoned away my strength, teasing out the essence of who I was until I would be just like them, captured eternally in blissful misery. With one last surge of willpower, I mustered the remnants of my strength and propelled myself off the table, crashing to the floor. But as I scrambled for the door, a chortle escaped her lips, an unsettling melody of control, hearing my broken breath spill all around as the room darkened, the shadows stretching out like fingers eager to grasp me. "You're not going anywhere," Elena's voice echoing through the abyss that enveloped us and drowning out the whispers turned wails behind me. I kicked the door, desperate and frantic, but it wouldn't budge, and when I turned back, the room had transformed. The walls morphed with grotesque limbs stretching toward me, snapping the air between us, sinister smiles glimmering in the half-light as if they knew fate wrapped closer around my throat. I dashed toward the window, the only remaining hope, but the moment I reached it, the frost turned to glass, slick and impenetrable, reflecting the disarray in my mind and trapping me in my own confusion. That was when I heard the most bone-chilling moment of all. Behind me, Elena laughed softly, the sound reverberating with the sinister promise of those she had claimed, and through the tortured fabric of reality, I understood. I was marked now, a thread in her tapestry, destined to join their ranks in that photo, smiling through sheer pain. In one final desperate plea, I mustered all the strength I had left and slammed my fist against the glass, the sound reverberating through the mocking hall, a stony reminder that my cheapness had led me here. All I had wanted was a moment of relaxation, and now, I was poised to become another victim of Elena's twisted hauntings, with nothing but a cursed understanding that sometimes the price you pay for comfort is far more costly than you could ever anticipate. I can still hear the creaking floorboards of my apartment, the way they groaned under the weight of the forgotten secrets that seemed to linger in every shadow, but that day was different. Despite the mid-afternoon light filtering through the blinds, casting striped patterns on the walls, I felt an unshakable heaviness in the air, a residue of dread that clung to me like static electricity. I'd invited my friend Jake over to share a meal, but my idea of a lunch date was about to spiral into something that would unravel not only our friendship but the very fabric of my sanity. I was attempting to impress him with my newfound obsession for health, whipping up a salad that looked more like a work of art than a meal, complete with organic arugula, heirloom tomatoes, and a drizzle of balsamic that I had learned to make myself. Not to mention, I had one of those fancy kitchen gadgets that spun leafy greens dry with the flourish of a magician. But as I chopped and mixed, a faint whisper of intuition nagged at the back of my mind, the nagging sense that I was being watched, an unshakable itch that made the hair on my arms stand on end, and while I brushed it off as paranoia, the feeling grew sharper the closer Jake's arrival approached. When he finally walked through the door, his easy smile momentarily soothed the prickle of anxiety that was gathering at my nape like the prelude to a storm. But the moment the door clicked shut, everything shifted. Jake's eyes darted around the living room, a shadow crossing his face, and for a split second, I saw something dark flicker in his gaze, accompanied by a strange tremor in his voice. As he complimented the salad, I felt a pang of unease as I noticed that neither of us could quite shake the feeling that we were no longer alone, an inhabitant lurking just beyond the periphery of our vision, an unsettled energy increasingly manifesting in the room, a heat pulsating beneath every ordinary surface, and yet I laughed off the anxiety like an unwanted house guest, convincing myself it was merely a figment of my overactive imagination. We sat down to eat, the vibrant colors of the salad contrasting sharply with the familiar surroundings, and as we dug into our bowls, the tension in the air morphed into something more palpable, saturating every bite, until Jake suddenly froze, eyes wide and unblinking, his fork hovering above his plate as he glanced toward the window. My heart began to race as he whispered, "Do you hear that?" That was when I realized the room had gone eerily silent, the mundane sounds of the outside world stifled as if sealed under glass, and just when I thought of dismissing it as nothing, I saw it. A figure in the reflection of the window, standing just out of reach on the fire escape, a long shadow stretching unnaturally against the bricks, and I instinctively but painfully squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was a trick of the light. But when I opened them again, nothing had changed except for the icy grip of fear tightening around my chest. Jake's breath quickened, and something flickered across his face. Was it recognition? But before I could process what was happening, the sound I had been dreading filled the air, a deep, guttural growl seeping through the walls as if my apartment itself was exhaling a long-held breath, and the light bulbs began to flicker, plunging us in and out of darkness as the figure continued to lurk outside, and as it stepped forward, I noticed what it was holding, a knife, glinting malevolently in the brief flashes of light. Jake turned to me, eyes wide with terror, and before I could speak, a cold realization sank in. He didn't just look frightened, he was terrified in a way that betrayed years of hidden knowledge, as if he recognized the threat with all too familiar terror. The color drained from his face as he pushed his chair back, making it screech against the floor like nails on a chalkboard, and in that dreadful moment, I understood, it wasn't just the figure beyond the window we should fear but something far worse. Jake's face twisted in horror, and he whispered, "Don't let it in," revealing that my seemingly innocent lunch had morphed into a battleground for survival. But just as I grasped the magnitude of our peril, my curiosity pushed me past the border of reason, compelling me toward the window, and that's when I began to feel a cold breeze, a whispering malevolence curling around me, and the moment I looked out, the figure flashed its blade toward me, its face veiled in darkness yet unmistakably human, with a smile that chilled my very soul, and in that instant, I felt the terrible weight of discovery. The figure wasn't an intruder at all, it was a reflection of everything I had ever tried to conceal, a version of myself I had buried out of shame, the darkness of my own mind given flesh and bone, and no amount of salad dressing could drown out the realization that I had laid out a feast for this very monstrosity. I used to pride myself on keeping my life free of drama. I was the kind of person who stepped around conflicts instead of wading through them. But one sweltering day in August, my carefully constructed world unraveled. It all started when I found myself in a crowded parking lot at the mall, wrestling with a deeply buried sense of frustration after a string of unfortunate events. The air was thick with exhaust, heat rising off the blacktop, and I felt that simmering irritation bubble over as I watched people casually jog back to their cars, laughing and shouting, while I gripped the edge of my shopping bag like a lifeline. As I turned to head back to my own car, I noticed a ridiculously shiny, red convertible parked right next to me, a gaudy, ostentatious vehicle that radiated vanity and entitlement. The urge to lash out bubbled up within me like carbonation fizzing out of control. My impulse to ruin someone's day became irresistible. I took a deep breath, forced a tight smile, and approached the car. It was just a harmless prank, I reasoned. I fished my keys out of my pocket, my heart racing at the idea of the scratch I was about to commit, envisioning the owner's face when they discovered the ugly line etched into their precious toy that would haunt them every time they glanced out of their window. I leaned in, pretending to tie my shoe, and let the jagged edge of my key dance across the surface, the metal biting into the paint as a wave of ridiculous glee crashed over me. But just as I stepped back, adrenaline coursing through my veins, I felt a sudden chill wash over me, the kind that tells you you're not alone. A sense of being watched crept over me, and I whipped my head around, scanning the lot. That's when I saw her, a woman with long, tangled hair and piercing green eyes, staring directly at me, her gaze unwavering, as if she had been there the whole time, silently judging me. Panic surged as I glanced back at the convertible, expecting to see her screaming or storming toward me, that villain on the other side of my selfish act, but instead, she lingered, a small, unnerving smile curling at her lips. A shiver weaved through my spine, but I shook it off and briskly walked to my own car, eager to escape the impending sense of doom. Days passed, and an unsettling feeling nestled deep within me, amplifying every minor inconvenience that came my way. The sound of car doors slamming became increasingly jarring, and I began seeing the woman everywhere, sipping coffee at the cafe, buying groceries, standing just beyond the doors of my workplace, her vibrant green eyes tracking me no matter how hard I tried to justify my behavior, no matter how far I ran. It was like I had inadvertently opened a door I couldn't close, a horror I could not shake. At night, I lay awake, heart pounding, convinced that every shadow outside my window was her, creeping closer, her smile widening like a sinister grin. Then came the night she finally showed up at my house. Standing motionless on the sidewalk, a featureless figure backlit by the street lamp, her long hair obscuring her face, I was frozen in terror. Gathering enough courage, I cracked the front door open, curious to see her expression, to hear her voice, but as I did, I could see that unsettling smile plastered on her face, eerily patient. "You made a mistake," she whispered, her voice as soft as silk but layered with venom, and a knot formed in my stomach as I realized I wasn't just a rat in a maze of my own making, there was something far worse at play. All the moments of panic came crashing together, and I started to understand that my act of malice had consequences, interconnected with something dark, something much larger than just a petty act of vandalism. I had set off an itch that scratched beneath my skin, something that wouldn't be pleased until it had taken its due. Over the next few weeks, I became haunted by a series of unexplainable events. My car broke down in the middle of nowhere on a desolate road, my phone kept dying at crucial moments, and I stumbled into horrifying accidents as if she were orchestrating my downfall. There was no respite, no way to escape her grasp. The The very air around me felt heavy with her intentions. Friends stopped calling, my coworkers began to look at me with concern, and my reflection warped in the mirror as paranoia seeped into my mind with a relentless elixir. I knew I couldn't hide forever. With each passing day, I was becoming less of a person and more a shell, hollowed out by fear. In desperation, I started researching the possibility of curses and hexes and came across a cult that practiced retribution for those who wronged others. I had to make amends, to restore balance, but how could I, after what I had done? I decided I could find the woman and apologize. Perhaps she would understand that it was a momentary loss of sanity, that the ugly impulse wasn't really me. But as I combed the neighborhood, the cafes, the park, the shops, she always seemed a step ahead, her eyes watching from a distance, silently reminding me of my crime. The only sound punctuating the air was the laughter of families enjoying their day unmarred by my despair. In a moment of utter defeat and insanity, I drove back to that parking lot, hoping against hope that she'd be there so I could make things right. Alas, the convertible was gone, replaced by mundane sedan, but I could feel her watching from the shadows. As I paced the lot, desperation clawing at my insides, I stumbled into a small truck parked at the edge, and there upon the windshield was a note: "You can't escape your sins." My blood turned to ice, the words felt alive, dripping with menace. I backed up, the click of keys echoed like a gunshot. Suddenly, I noticed the woman materialized beside the truck. In the half-light, her smile morphed into something grotesque, stretching unnaturally, hauntingly, and I realized this was not over. Not for me. Not ever. The last thing I saw before everything faded into darkness was her hand gripping my arm, pulling me back into the shadows, leaving me with a horrifying realization that I was trapped in my own twisted fate, my act of cruelty reverberating endlessly, an inescapable loop of misery that would take control of my soul. It was a bleak Tuesday when I received the email that changed my life forever. The subject line read, "Notice of layoff," and as I skimmed through the corporate jargon, my heart sank. They weren't just cutting jobs, they were dismantling the entire team I had put my heart and soul into for nearly a decade, leaving me reeling with a mix of disbelief and fury. In my haze of rejection, I found myself wandering through the empty hallways of our once bustling office, the fluorescent lights flickering like the last breaths of a dying entity. That's when I stumbled into the conference room, the long table bearing the scars of countless meetings, and I felt a rage boiling within me. We had built this company, nurtured it like a child, and now it was crumbling before my eyes. Then an absurd thought crept into my mind: what if I could take it all back? What if I could extract something valuable from this tainted experience? I glanced around, half convinced I was the only one left, but the urge to fight back began to overshadow any sense of morality. I thought about how much the building was worth. I thought about all the nights I had poured myself into my work, the unseen hours of my life spent crafting it into a success. Could I really do this? The inner debate clawed at my conscience as I slipped out into the parking lot, a new plan forming amidst the shadows of the setting sun. I reached out to a shady acquaintance I had met at a party years ago. He was entangled in the world of real estate, and let's be real, the type of guy who took risks most people wouldn't dream of. He was my ticket to selling the office space, a playground for my ill intentions. It felt wrong, yet exhilarating, like a game I was making up as I went along. Over the next few weeks, I orchestrated a covert operation, announcing my resignation through an email that dripped with professionalism while I plotted behind the scenes. I arranged for a meeting with the supposed buyer, a nameless individual who didn't ask too many questions. The deal was rapid. It was as if he could smell the desperation writhing beneath my carefully composed exterior and was too eager to take advantage. A few signatures and a hefty cash sum later, I stood before a stack of bills that I couldn't quite comprehend, my pulse racing with unfamiliar adrenaline. At first, I felt on top of the world, the money sitting pretty in my bank account like a trophy for the greatest heist in my fictionalized life. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of my decision began to crush down on me. I didn't anticipate the rumors that would swell like a tsunami, former coworkers reaching out, stunned at the sudden closure of their beloved workplace, confusion turning to outrage as whispers of betrayal filtered back to me. I was forced to keep my phone on silent and delete my social media, hoping to weather the storm of judgment that felt inescapable. One night, when the guilt became unbearable, I drove back to the office, a shell of its former self, quiet and still, as if mourning the loss of what it had once been. I thought, maybe, I could reverse it all, perhaps I could offer to buy it back, somehow rearrange the pieces into something that resembled morality. But as I stood outside, clutching my phone and grappling with the ethical implications of my choices, I felt the temperature drop. an icy chill that crept into my bones. When I turned to leave, I glanced back one last time, and that's when I saw them, figures standing in the windows, silhouettes of my past colleagues, their faces contorted in expressions of anguish and disbelief, as if they were silently screaming at me, tethered to the place I had unceremoniously stolen from them. Panic surged through me, a raw, visceral terror. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing, my fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and I fled to my car, my mind echoing with the memories of the faces I'd left behind. Guilt gnawed at me like a ravenous beast, and I dared not sleep, fearing what dreams might come. I avoided all mirrors, terrified of what I might see lurking behind my own reflection, the true monster I'd allowed myself to become. A few sleepless nights later, the consequences of my actions began to unravel the fabric of my life. I received a call from an anonymous number, no one I recognized. When I picked up, a gravelly voice greeted me, chilling in the late-night stillness. "You think you can just take it and run?" It rasped, low and loaded with ominous intent. My heart stopped, the voice was too familiar, an echo of my past mingled with a sense of dread. I barely managed to mumble a feeble response before the line went dead. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a grave mistake, one that was on the verge of haunting me beyond imagination. The days turned to weeks once more, and dread loomed like a dark cloud over my reality. I received strange packages at my front door, pieces of furniture from the office, photographs that had once hung on the walls, each accompanied by a note dripping with escalating threats. "You can't escape, we see you." I began to question my sanity. Was this some twisted game? Soon, every minor noise became an anxiety-inducing event, every creak in my home awoke the specter of fear. I started placing makeshift locks on my windows and barricading my doors, convinced someone, or something, was crawling closer. My once serene sanctuary felt like a coffin, the walls closing in. All the while, my past colleagues were out there. What if they too had been watching? What if they had taken my betrayal as personal revenge? Nothing I did could erase the guilt or the gnawing suspicion that I was being hunted, my own demons turning on me under the poisoned light of my choices. My paranoia reached a fever pitch when I discovered an envelope on my doorstep marked with dreaded handwriting that struck a chord deep in my chest. "You think this is over?" It read. Beneath it lay a faded group photo of my ex-coworkers, their faces contorted with grief, blood splattering the corners, as if stained by their rejection of me. I felt sick to my stomach, and, in that moment, my heart thudded violently against my ribs. I returned to the office once more, fully determined to confront my demons. The ominous presence weighing heavily around me made the air thick and hard to breathe. The building loomed dark and eerily silent as I pushed the door open, the emptiness echoing back at me. I stepped inside, hoping to find a remnant of familiarity, a shred of comfort from a time filled with shared laughter and dreams, but every echo around me felt like a specter rising from the past. That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. I turned quickly, adrenaline pumping, my rationality slipping further and further away. Shadows danced just at the edge of my sight, darting around, orchestrated by a puppeteer unseen. My pulse quickened as I wrestled with the reality that maybe they were waiting for me, maybe the tales whispered about corporate betrayal had somehow morphed into nightmares that did not die, but lived forever through vengeance. I felt the claws of remorse sinking deeper, tangible in the air, heavy with loss and regret, a suffocating blanket that made it impossible to breathe. And just as I came to an agonizing realization that I could no longer hide from my sins, the shadows encroached, forming into figures once too familiar yet now twisted by betrayal, their eyes glinting with betrayal, hurt, and a hunger for justice that demanded a blood price. I had entered a darkened scene that would never forgive my transgression, silence shattered by their collective mumblings, rising into painful wails that echoed through the empty halls of that once vibrant space. I found myself unable to turn away or escape their grasp, the horror dawning upon me that my crime wasn't just about the building, it was the lives I had disrupted, the dreams I had crushed as I exchanged their legacy for a few moments of power and greed. As everything around me faded into shadow, I understood that there are debts to be paid, and sometimes, what you try to take from others might just take you back in a way you could never foresee. In that merciless silence, all I could hear were the echoes of what I had thrown away, and what was now coming back to claim my soul. I never thought a simple doodle could turn my life upside down. But it all started that fateful Tuesday when the deadline for my marketing project loomed large and the stress made me feel like I was about to burst. It was a typical day at the office, the hum of fluorescent lights melding with the occasional clatter of keyboards, and I was desperately trying to seek a moment of relief from the pressure when I resorted to doodling on the back of a scrap sheet. Just mindless sketches at first, but I found my hand taking a mind of its own, the ink flowing freely until a crude image of a woman began to emerge, her voluptuous curves exaggerated to the point of absurdity, and before I knew it, I had created something that certainly crossed the line of professionalism. It was supposed to be a throwaway, an escape from the mundane, but somehow in my delirium, I thought it might be a hilarious prank to leave it in the bathroom for my co-workers to find. So, with a chuckle and a misplaced sense of bravado, I left the sketch taped near the mirror, knowing my colleagues would be amused, perhaps shocked, but definitely entertained. The toilet blobbed behind me as I walked back to my desk, a thrilling but irresponsible sense of rebellion flooding my veins. The day trudged on, filled with meetings and pressure, but then, as the clock struck 4, I heard an explosion of laughter from the bathroom. I felt a rush of vindication, it was a hit. But as I wrapped up my workday and headed home, my mind buzzing with excitement, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The laughter felt wrong, ringing with a twisted edge, almost manic, echoing like it was too loud for just a few people. When I arrived home, my phone buzzed relentlessly. Messages from my coworkers flooded my screen, filled with emojis and jokes referencing the doodle. In one instant, I felt like a hero and a villain, but as the hours passed, I noticed something unsettling, a particular text from Dave, our office's mild-mannered IT guy. "You think this is funny? You better watch your back." I laughed it off, convincing myself that it was all in good fun, but deep down, the laughter from earlier replayed in my head, mulling over the twisted undertones that chilled me. That night, I dreamt of the doodle. It warped and morphed, the figure contorting in ways that made my skin crawl, and when I jolted awake at 3 a.m., soaked in a cold sweat, all I could feel was dread gnawing at my insides. I couldn't shake the feeling that the laughter hadn't been innocent, there was something sinister lurking behind it. I chalked it up to stress and decided to apologize to my team the next day, a simple acknowledgement of my poor judgment. However, as I walked into the office, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The usual banter was replaced by hushed whispers, glances thrown in my direction that melted into uncomfortable silence as I approached my desk. Dave was waiting for me, unusually calm with an unsettling grin plastered across his face, and every ounce of my previous bravado melted into cold fear. "You really think you're funny, don't you?" he said softly, but the words dripped with a venomous edge. I attempted to downplay the incident, but he lunged forward, placing a finger on my shoulder with a grip that felt like ice. "You've awakened something, don't you understand? That doodle, it wasn't just a joke, it was an invitation." His bloodshot eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, my laughter felt like a distant memory. The panicked feeling rose again, the kind that tells you something has gone horribly awry. A gnawing uncertainty fed by fragments of laughter echoed in my mind as I made my way to the bathroom, heart racing. When I swung the door open, I was met with an eerie silence, thick and oppressive. The mirror reflected the paper, now besmirched with something dark, blotches that appeared to grow like a virus, twisting and shifting the joyful cartoon into something grotesque. My heart sank as I recalled a fleeting thought, a split second of realization that what I drew had taken on a life of its own when the walls of laughter disappeared. My phone buzzed with another text from Dave, "You shouldn't have left it there." My blood ran cold, the laughter was now replaced with an airy ambience that felt like a predator breathing down my neck. I bolted from the bathroom and gathered my things, determination flooding my veins to get the hell out of there, but as I made my way to the exit, I was met with a blockade of coworkers, faces twisted in glee, eyes vacant, they weren't themselves anymore. Then I noticed a figure in the back, dark and looming, shrouded in shadows, where the light seemed to shun away. It grinned in a grotesque parody of laughter, a visage that echoed the thing I had drawn, long limbs sprawled and a wide mouth that split too far too wide, and as it stepped into the light, I saw the blend of my doodle and something grotesquely real. It was then I realized, horror seeping into my core, that they weren't just laughing at me, they were all a part of it now. Puppets danced to a tune I had unwittingly composed, and the line between my nightmare and reality had blurred. I dashed for the exit, my heart pounding in tandem with the ultimate realization. I had opened the door to madness, and no one, especially not my own hands, would keep the darkness at bay. I escaped into the murky embrace of night, never looking back until now, each sleepless night feeding into the whispers of my former co-workers, and though I've tried my best to just forget, every corner I turn flickers with memories of laughter, and that suffocating shadow that stretches ever closer, hungry for a new doodle, a new invitation to join its sinister party. My son is a freshman in high school and frequently oversleeps, missing his bus, and I get so mad at him for this, but what unnerves me the most is what he says about his dreams. The strange, vivid nightmares that seemed to linger even in the daylight hours, whispering through the cracks of our home. Just 3 weeks into the school year, he missed the bus for the second time, and I stormed into his room, ready to unleash the frustration I had been bottling up for too long. Yet, when I saw him there, tangled in his sheets, sweat glistening on his forehead, I felt a twist of concern wrap around my anger. "Don't you care about school? What's wrong with you?" I shouted, the words coming out sharper than I intended. He stirred, squinting at me, eyes clouded with a disoriented fear I didn't understand. "Mom," he replied in a whisper, "it's not the bus, it's the dreams." As he recounted them, my heart sank. He talked about a man in the shadows, tall and impossibly thin, with fingers like spider legs that reached out towards him, scraping at his soul. I could see the fear pooling in his eyes, and while I wanted to dismiss it as typical teenage over-exaggeration, something in his voice made my skin prickle. The man, he said, was relentless, ushering in a collapsing world where echoes of forgotten monstrosities taunted him in twisted reflections of our home. I brushed off his fears, thinking it was just stress from the transition to high school, but over the next few weeks, my son continued to oversleep, and his grades started slipping. Even worse, he would wander through our house in a daze, mumbling about the man with the long fingers and how he could feel him pulling him back into the dream, weaving a darkness around him that was starting to invade our waking life. I tried grounding him, taking away his phone, and even seeking advice from a doctor, but nothing changed. Then one night, just after he'd missed yet another bus, I heard noises coming from his room, like muffled cries or soft thuds, and I hesitated before knocking. When I finally twisted the knob and opened the door, I was met with an unsettling sight. He was standing in the middle of his room, eyes closed, face contorted in fear, his hands waving about as if he were fighting something unseen. "Get out!" he screamed suddenly, and I took a step back, my stomach dropping as I realized he wasn't talking to me. "He's right behind you!" he shrieked, and I felt the air grow thick with an almost palpable dread. I hesitated, caught between instinct and terror, and before I could make a move, he collapsed, silencing the room. Terrified, I rushed to him, checking for a pulse, trying to ground him in reality as I called for help into the nothingness. Days turned into weeks, his mind becoming a battlefield between wakefulness and haunted dreams, each night more harrowing than the last, all while I helplessly watched my son slip away. I devised a plan, thinking perhaps if he faced the man in his dreams, it would empower him. Little did I know how wrong that would go. That night, I placed a recorder next to his bed, hoping to capture his nightmares for us to dissect together in daylight, convinced that knowledge would shed light on the darkness. But instead of clarity, I heard the chilling entities spill from his lips as he slept, words too dark to understand, curses and urgent warnings about the dangers of dreams should one dare to cross the threshold. When I listened back, I felt an uncanny presence wash over me, squeezing at my heart as the screeching rasp of the man echoed in the night. Each morning, I would find him deeper in the clutches of those twisted dreams, with fewer and fewer lucid moments, and that's when I began to see the changes in the house, shadows darting just beyond the corner of my vision, items displaced, and the feeling of something waiting just outside our realm. I finally sought comfort from a local folklore expert who spoke of dream realms and entities that fed off fears, suggesting a ritual to release my son from the grip of this dream taker. With reluctance but desperate hope, I followed her instructions. I lit candles, burned sage, and called his spirit to fight back while he slept. Just as I finished, a sound broke the silence, a low, rumbling laugh that sent chills down my spine. I ran to his room, finding it empty, the only evidence of his presence being the broken recorder splayed in pieces on the floor, and that's when I noticed the dark figure standing in the doorway, the skin stretched tight against the bone, fingers long and twisting like branches reaching for answers. Heart racing, I shouted for my son, but the entity only stepped closer, its breath foul, filled with whispers that clawed at my sanity. I felt a surge of parental instinct and lunged forward, but it was almost a tangible wall of darkness that forced me back, planting me against the wall, breath stolen, watching helplessly as two blank holes stared straight through me. I finally found my voice, realizing in desperation that the man hadn't just been a dream, he was here, binding my son in chains forged from nightmares. Just as hope dimmed, a figure erupted into the room, my son's voice charging back from the depths. He chanted words I didn't recognize but felt powerful, and with every syllable, the atmosphere shifted, the figure recoiled, screeching as it faded back into the shadows. And then silence. My son collapsed again, this time still, and I rushed to him, wrapping my arms around him more to hold on to sanity than comfort. After a moment, he He stirred, groggy but present, and when he opened his eyes, there was something darker lurking beneath. He didn't speak of the dream or the figure or what had truly happened, he only murmured, "I'm sorry, Mom, for everything." I brushed the guilt away, wanting to assure him it would be all right, but the distance in his gaze spoke volumes about what we had unleashed and lost. I soon discovered that my son wasn't the only one waking up each day with shadows lingering just behind his eyes. As days turned bittersweet, I realized the man might not let us go so easily, and I learned that every morning when I wake him up for school, I'm battling more than just his reluctance to rise. I'm battling the silence in my home that grows heavier with each sunset, and the chilling realization that my son's freshman year might turn out to be not just the beginning of adolescence, but rather, a descent into a nightmare from which we may never truly awaken. Growing up in a small, predominantly white town, I always felt like an outsider, not because of my race. My dad was white and my mom was Puerto Rican, but because I lacked the adventurous backstory that so many of my classmates boasted about. If your family hails from somewhere exotic, it automatically grants you some status at school, and I craved that validation, so I began to weave elaborate tales of my heritage, claiming to be part mysterious immigrant, part ancient warrior, and the bits I conjured up dazzled my peers, who greeted my colorful stories with admiration and envy. My first tall tale involved claiming I was half Japanese, spinning tales about my supposed samurai ancestors who escaped the feudal wars to find peace and prosperity in America. As my friends eagerly devoured every word, I felt a rush of power, a thrill that overshadowed the gnawing guilt of my deceit. Sinister whispers danced in the back of my mind, warning me that eventually, I would get caught. Yet the deeper I dug into my fabrications, the more it felt like a game, albeit a dangerous one. I was invited to a cultural weekend at school, and panic clotted my gut as I realized I'd need to maintain my lies. That night, I plunged into hours of research, learning about Japanese traditions and even attempting to learn some phrases, dreaming of the moment I could regale everyone with a perfectly articulated story of my ancestry. When the weekend arrived, I showed up in a makeshift kimono I'd crafted from an old bedsheet, feeling like a fraud but riding high on their expectations, until it all spiraled out of control. One of my classmates, a boy named Ethan, had a knack for spotting inconsistencies, and halfway through my elaborate presentation, he asked me about my family's Japanese recipes. Like a deer caught in headlights, I floundered, desperately trying to remember the few dishes I had read about. Embarrassment washed over me, and in a moment of sheer panic, I blurted out, "My grandma's secret recipe for curry." Everyone stood silent for a heartbeat, and then erupted into laughter. Instead of faltering, I leaned into it, assuming a goofy grin that seemed to endear me to them. Little did I know these moments of perceived genius would burrow deeper into my conscience. The facade continued. I claimed experiences I had never lived, friendships I had never forged, and adventures I had never embarked on, until they became part of my being, sinking beneath the skin and dictating a life I hadn't truly lived. As the years trickled by, the details blurred, bleeding into each other, and I felt a yawning chasm of loneliness open up inside of me as the need to exist in this fabricated identity intensified. What should have been the innocent ebb and flow of teenage existence became a minefield of extremes. Then came prom night, a long-awaited event I had eagerly anticipated but now felt bitterly unprepared for. I walked into that gym, convinced everyone could see right through me, that they would unravel the threads of lies woven into my persona. Yet, to my surprise, I was swept into the limelight, voted prom queen on the strength of my popularity, but just as the music swelled and I was lifted into the spotlight, Ethan appeared, standing at the periphery, gauging my every move with a scrutinizing gaze. He didn't take his eyes off me, and there was an unease in his demeanor that felt spine-chilling. The evening unfolded in highlights of laughter and dancing, but Ethan refused to let me forget his presence, a shadow looming over my splendor like a harbinger of doom. The moment came when he cornered me in a quiet back corridor, away from the jubilation, and leaned into me, nostrils flaring as he hissed, "You're a fraud. You've spent every waking moment lying to us, haven't you?" The world spun, the industry of my laughter drowned in his venomous accusation, the pop of the balloon I had inflated in my own mind bursting with such a finality that it knocked the wind out of me. I could see the disdain in his eyes as he drew back his hand as if to strike, but rather than fury, there was pity. The quiet of that hallway was deafening as he left me there, battered and exposed, and every friend I had ever forged an unsound bond with scattered back into the dance, unaware that the girl they adored was merely a reflection of their expectations, a hollow shell. I spent the summer hiding, grappling with the festering abomination of my lies until I decided to come clean back at school. When the new term started, I gathered my courage and faced them, But my confession fell flat. Rather than the validation I anticipated, I was met with cold indifference. They had moved on, their lives untouched by my turmoil, and in that moment, I understood I was eternally shackled to my fabrications, misplaced in an unkind world, condemned to exist as a ghost haunting my own history, too terrified to admit the truth, the simple fact that I would never belong nowhere, not even in my own skin. And in that realization, I finally understood that sometimes, the stories we tell, no matter how beautifully woven, can entrap us in a web of our own making, spiraling us into the darkness, never to escape. I have major daddy issues that molded me into who I am today, and it all started the summer I turned 11. That's when my father, a jovial man with a bellowing laugh and an unapologetically booming personality, vanished from my life without warning, leaving only a note that felt more like a sinister riddle than a farewell: find me in the shadows. My mother, fragile and devoid of her former brightness, became a ghost in our house, her silence speaking volumes about her heartbreak and my insatiable curiosity. I spent the next few weeks searching for answers in every crevice of our old Victorian home, the attic where I discovered a wrapped shoebox filled with my father's belongings, Polaroids of him with strangers, cryptic letters, and a worn-out pocket watch that ticked off the seconds like they were taunting my insecurities. It felt as if those remnants had been imbued with an aura of guilt and dread. I convinced myself that he wasn't dead but rather lost among the shadows, waiting for the day I would find him. I grew up chasing ghosts, eyes darting down dark alleys and desolate corners where light barely touched, certain that if I just looked hard enough, I'd uncover the truth behind his departure. Each failed attempt deepened the wound, and as adolescence hit me hard with a rush of insecurities, I turned to unhealthy relationships, starving for validation wherever I could find it. The first boy who told me I was beautiful became my world, but when he ghosted me like my father had, I hollowed out even further, my heart breaking each time another guy tried to earn my trust only to shatter it like fine porcelain. The summer after high school ended, as I was desperately trying to forge a new identity from the shards of my past, I made a pact with a friend to attend a party at an abandoned warehouse, where the rumor was that ghosts lingered, the kind that spoke of lost loves and unresolved familial issues. I brushed off the idea as ridiculous, but with a drink in my hand and traces of freedom on my lips, I followed a group into those hallowed halls where the music pulsed like a living entity, and the air throbbed with unexplainable tension. It was there, beneath flickering lights and haunting whispers, that I met him, a charismatic stranger who seemed to see straight into my fractured soul. He introduced himself simply as Jake, with eyes that glinted with a familiar mischief, his smile laced with secrets that drew me in like a moth to flame. He never asked about my past, instead, he listened to my nightmarish stories as if he were savoring each word, pulling me deeper into an intoxicating spiral of laughter and shared secrets. Yet, the more I opened up about my father's disappearance, the more Jake seemed unsettled, his gaze flitting to the darkness just beyond the reach of light. One night, while we wandered through abandoned neighborhoods, I impulsively suggested we hunt for ghosts, half seriously hoping to catch a glimpse of my dad. Jake smiled, albeit with a tinge of hesitation, and led me to a desolate park where the moon cast eerie shadows among the trees, the chilling silence blanketing us like an ominous presence waiting to be awakened. As Jake recounted tales of lost spirits, I felt an unexpected surge of hope, convinced that this would be the night I'd confront my past and find my dad. Hours slipped away like sand through our fingers, and just as the clock struck midnight, the air turned ice cold. The dark branches seemed to sway like skeletal fingers beckoning us closer, and for the first time, I felt the weight of expectation on my shoulders. "What if he's right there, watching you?" Jake whispered, his voice sending shivers down my spine. I spun around, half expecting my father to emerge from the shadows, but instead, it was a spectral vision, my father, looking every bit the same as I remembered, except his empty eyes were now gunmetal gray, filled with a mix of meaning and torment. I trembled, my heart pounding against my ribs as I reached out for him, but the air around me thickened with an unfathomable dread. Jake's expression shifted from admiration to fear, and before I could comprehend what was happening, he screamed for me to run. I felt the darkness surge, twisting and pulling at my sanity, and I bolted back through the park while the looming figure of my father faded further into the shadows, an unfulfilled promise lingering in the air. In the days that followed, I spiraled into a pit of despair, questioning everything and everyone. Jake, who had seemed to understand me so well, became another ghost. It was only later, when I came across the very pocket watch from the attic at a garage sale, that the horror unfolded. Its broken chime rang through my mind as if awakening memories buried deep. Every tick became a reminder of my father's absence, dragging forth the realization that the truth lay not in the shadows of my childhood but in the reflection of the man I had compromised myself to be. I never saw Jake again, not in this world or the next, but his words echoed in my mind like a haunting whisper, reminding me that my daddy issues were not just about abandonment, they were about the shadows I carried, shaping me into someone who searched for love in all the wrong places. It's been years, but I'm still haunted, forever trapped in a cycle of seeking those familiar patterns, the echoes of my father's laughter, and the lingering question, will I ever be enough for someone to stay?